Good morning. Thank you for your interest in our fellowship program in endocrinology, diabetes, and metabolism. My name is David Ehrmann. I've been in the section of endocrinology since 1988, and I came here in 1985 to do my fellowship. I thought that it might be important for you to hear a little bit about our academic program and my particular interests, although you should by now have received a very comprehensive brochure about our program. I still think it might be helpful to hear a little bit about how each individual faculty member functions in the section. So my background is that I was an undergraduate at the University of Michigan, and I went there for medical school, stayed there for residency, but finally moved to Chicago for fellowship in endocrinology in 1985. And initially my interest was in thyroid disease. I was doing some basic research, but came to learn that my real strength came in clinical research when I rotated through the Clinical Research Center with the chief of pediatric endocrinology at the time. And he was interested, this is Dr. Bob Rosenfield, in steroidogenic abnormalities in women with PCOS, adolescents with PCOS. And in rounding with him and doing the clinical research, I found that I was in my home, that this was something I wanted to do. So initially, we embarked upon a set of studies that examined the steroidogenic abnormalities in ovarian function in PCOS using as a probe a GnRH agonist at the time called nafarelin, and now people use leuprolide. So we characterized a specific type of steroidogenic abnormality in these women. From that point, we did some additional studies looking at the relationship between PCOS and diabetes. And at this point in time, it's well known that these women have a high risk for developing type 2 diabetes. What we didn't know is that there may be a familial basis for this, and that familial abnormality may relate, at least in part, to defects in beta cell function or insulin secretory defects. It was known that these women are very insulin resistant, but in order to develop diabetes, one needs a second abnormality or an additional hit, so to speak. And defects in insulin secretion are really the hallmark of development of dysglycemia or impaired glucose tolerance in diabetes. So this is something that we moved on to. We looked at the genetics of PCOS, and then our interest sort of shifted a bit more, looking in collaboration with Ed von Cotter and the sleep group at the relationship between sleep apnea and PCOS and its metabolic disturbances. And what we found was that there's a very high prevalence of sleep apnea in women with PCOS, as you might expect, but the abnormality is well beyond what you would expect for the degree of obesity. So we postulated that it may be testosterone as the culprit for the increased risk for sleep apnea, because we know that men have a higher risk of sleep apnea than women. But it turns out that the testosterone levels were not particularly elevated in those with sleep apnea compared to those without sleep apnea, as long as the woman had PCOS. So that led us to think about how to extend our findings. And we've done some studies in that regard. My other interest, overarching interest really, is in identifying populations at high risk for development of diabetes and then trying to mitigate that risk. So we've been a center for many years in the Diabetes Prevention Program, the DPP, and the DPPOS, or DPP Outcome Study. And we also recently completed a multi-center study looking at prediabetes and newly diagnosed diabetes called the RISE study, which stands for Restoring Insulin Secretion in pre-diabetics. And we had an intervention with either gastric banding or medication in adults and then just medication interventions in children. And the results of these studies have been published primarily in Diabetes Care, but elsewhere in addition. So that gives you a little bit about my background interest. I do clinical work. I see patients in clinic several days per week. I work in the CRC doing clinical research, and I also do administrative work and what one would expect at this point in my career. So I'd be happy to talk to any of you individually. I'm glad that you're interested. I think this is a wonderful opportunity to learn basic clinical and translational endocrinology, diabetes, and metabolism, and I welcome you to Chicago. Thank you very much. Good to meet you.